It's going through the setting up, redirecting. And we're live.
Welcome to today's virtual cafecito, hosted by Moms Clean Air Force, Corazon Latino, and EcoMadres. So, this election cycle, Black women, Latinas, women of color, turned out in record numbers, showing the power of communities of color at the polls. As we look to a new administration, we know it is because Black, Brown, and Indigenous people delivered this win through community organizing, strategy, and a labor of love. So during this cafecito, we'll really explore the underlying issues between communities of color and how we can collectively make a difference in the fight for clean air and climate action, not only at the hyperlocal level, but beyond, as communities of color carry the burden of the climate crisis. My name is Betsy Lopez-Wagner, and I'm a principal and chief strategist at Lopez-Wagner Strategies. Alongside my team, we work with mission-driven individuals, organizations, and companies like those you're about to hear from to advance social good and climate justice. I'll be your moderator for today's session, and I'm joining y'all from Michigan this evening, a key battleground state in the 2020 election. I'm joined today by three colleagues, Mujeres Poderosas, strong women. I'm gonna introduce you to Cinthia Zermeño Moore, who's here on behalf of Moms EcoMadres in Nevada. She's a Nevada field organizer and an EcoMadres co-leader, and she's been advocating for clean air, clean energy, and clean water and water conservation for over 10 years throughout her work in Nevada. She's also the mother of a toddler. You're gonna hear from Tonya Calhoun, National Field Manager of Moms Clean Air Force. Tonya believes that clean air is a fundamental right and understands that many across this nation are denied that very right every day in communities across the country. Tonya spent over 15 years in the field of volunteer management, utilizing her skills and power for change to create resources for so many, including volunteer programs and so much more. You're also joined today by Molly Michael. She is the project manager for Moms Clean Air Force, with over 2 decades of experience in advocacy and communications and issues ranging from air, like you're about to hear from low-income children to arts and cultural programs in New York. She is coming to us live from Philadelphia, where she lives in South Philadelphia with her husband and their 2 daughters. So we're going to turn the platform over to Cinthia. Cindy's going to really guide us through a lot of connections around Latino voters and EPA rollbacks and bring us into this conversation. Cinthia?
Thank you for that, Betsy. I am in Las Vegas and I have been here my entire life. And like Betsy mentioned, I have been involved in the fight for clean air and clean water for over 10 years. At first, I was doing it because it was something that was important to me, but that all changed when I had my son 3 years ago. That's when I really became really involved in this fight and wanting to make sure that we do have clean air and clean water. Especially after I started seeing the negative effects having bad air quality was having on his small body and just the allergy issues that he has experienced since he was 1, and just how him growing up right now is completely different than how it was for me growing up in the same city, in the same neighborhood. And I just want to make sure that I'm fighting for him, and not just him, but other kids as well. And I was really motivated to vote this election for so many reasons. And I vote every election. I vote on local elections when a lot of people are not paying attention, but I felt like this was an election that I could just not let go without me voting. And I went back and forth trying to figure out how I was going to vote because of the pandemic. At first I thought, well, maybe I'm just going to mail in my ballot, but for the life of me, I couldn't remember what my signature looked like. So I decided that I was going to go and early vote in the community center down the street from my house. And I did it because, one, I wanted to ensure that whoever was elected was going to be someone that was going to fight for our children's future and get us back in the right direction. The other reason is because while I have been here my entire life, I haven't always lived in the States. I was brought here when I was 3 months old. And in 2008 is when I was able to vote for the first time. I became a naturalized citizen in 2007. And I have a lot of family members that are not able to vote because either they're legal permanent residents or they're DACA recipients, or they are here undocumented. And these are the people that don't have a voice, and many of the issues that are being addressed at the national level will have a direct impact on them. I decided to vote, and oftentimes people think of the Latino community and they think that there's only one issue that drives us, but it's not. It's not just immigration. That's our top issue. One of the top issues is education and jobs, because a lot of times our families come here from our homeland country looking for better education opportunities for their children and also for better paying jobs. But also the other thing that's been driving our community to the polls is because the EPA in the last 4 years has done over 100 rollbacks. And while there's been a lot of testimony and support to strengthen a lot of standards, for example, smog standards, the EPA has decided that the current standards are good enough, even though we're all living with what the current standards are and living with the consequences. In Las Vegas, we are the #9 city in the entire country that's listed under the American Lung Association State of the Air report as having one of the most dirty air quality days in the entire country. Last year, we were #13, and 1 year we moved up 4 spots. So it's obvious that the current standards are not good enough. We need to strengthen them, and we need to make sure that the next EPA is listening to the folks testifying and pursuing these standards. And that's also part of the reason why I was motivated to turn out and vote, because I felt like even though I was testifying, my voice wasn't heard. And guess what? My vote in the ballot box was my voice. And I'm not alone in this. Yesterday, there was a poll that was released that was done by the Latino Decisions and EDF. And 84% of Latino voters believe it's important for the next Congress to pass legislation to reduce greenhouse emissions. Actually, it's 91%, I'm sorry. So almost 100% of the Latino voters that were surveyed think it's a high priority for Congress to address our greenhouse gas emissions. The other thing that is extremely important, and I mentioned the EPA, I'm not the only one that thinks the rollbacks are important. 87% of the Latino voters surveyed believe it's important or extremely important for the EPA to reinstate some of those rollbacks. Now, I also found it interesting being in Nevada, 82% of the Latino voters surveyed think that it's important for investments in clean energy jobs like wind and solar. And it's no secret that in Nevada, we have many sunshine days. We don't have rainy days. It hasn't rained in over 6 months. So we do have a lot of sunshine, and there's a lot of opportunity for clean jobs and helping grow our economy and helping reduce our current unemployment rate. So those were the reasons why I was motivated to vote, why some of my family members that are able to vote turn out to vote, and some of my neighbors and friends. And I know there's many other people in this country that turned out to vote for those same reasons.
Yeah, thank you so much, Cindy. I really think that's a clear reflection of when we show up, like we get to vote on all of the priorities that we have. And that's so instrumental, as you noted, for your community, for those that can't. I know, Molly, you're going to really be able to walk us through next. What is that? What is that disproportionate impact that, so often gets us to the polls and gets us to be advocates not only for our communities, but for the communities of others, as we start to really think about, disproportionate impact of pollution.
Yeah, it was really so wonderful to hear. And first of all, I wanted to thank all three of you for inviting me to join this conversation today. It's just such a joy to work with such amazing colleagues and to talk about these issues with you. But Cindy, when you were talking about who you vote for and why you vote, there's so much overlap there for me and why in the reasons that I vote and how important it is to me and what it means. But I know that once I started working in this and advocating for better climate policy and trying to really do better for my children, right? It made me, as I learned more about, and here in Philadelphia, we have very poor air quality as well, Cindy. I feel you in Las Vegas. We don't have the heat compounding it, all year long like you do. But when then I started noticing in my kids' school that I was in the nurse's office years ago, and there's just a cabinet full of asthma medications, just an astounding number of asthma medications. And this is a majority, a school that is majority kids of color, from immigrant families, majority low income families. And I was just like that. I don't remember that from when I was a kid, right? And I started looking at numbers and started trying to figure out, like, what is the asthma rate? I hear from my kids' school principal, there's over 900 students there. The numbers of kids with asthma that they even know about is astounding. And so I started looking at asthma rates in Philadelphia, and Philadelphia is a city majority of communities of color. And I looked at the national rates of asthma among kids and then the asthma rates in Philadelphia. And that's double the national average is what we have here. And we have poor air quality, which exacerbates asthma. And we have, enormous amounts of pollution spewing from, nearby and far away polluting industries. So when I started looking at that, then I went the next step deeper and I said, well, what do these kids with asthma look like? Who are they? And the majority of those kids with asthma in a city that has twice the national average already is significantly higher among kids of color, Latinos and Black kids in particular. And so when you look at that and I started realizing, well, this isn't even really about my kids. This is about all of the other kids who are breathing more polluted air because they grew up next to the oil refinery over in Southwest Philly that's now closed, thank goodness. But they're enduring a significant number of other polluting factors in their lives simply because of the zip code they live in here in Philadelphia or the zip code they live in anywhere, because their communities have been systematically taken advantage of for generations. And so what I think about when I have these conversations with you ladies, as the white woman in the room, I think it's what a joy and a privilege it is for me to be able to hear your perspective, to understand how big this is and how hard we all have to work together as a unified front, as a team. We're all women here, on the panel. We do it for our kids and our nieces and nephews and other kids. And, I think my perspective is always in the grand scheme of things, it's not my kids who are suffering more. It's not about them. It's about the entire community. And what are we doing to uplift and support and keep healthy and safe the entire community? So I'm sure we're going to talk more about all of those things, but I also, right before I pass the mic, I was looking at a survey that was done last month by EDF and We Act about the understanding of what pollution does in communities of color. And only 38% of white people surveyed thought or understood that Black communities suffer disproportionate impacts from pollution, and only 34% of white Americans who were surveyed thought that Latinos were disproportionately impacted by pollution. So I feel like I have an even greater responsibility to help people understand how important this is, because there is a lack of awareness. And of all different demographics surveyed, white people were the least aware that climate change is harming, could impact their life, like their life depends on it. They're like, we were the people who were like, I don't know, and communities of color are so much more aware and so much more, understanding and cognizant of that. And I would love to hear, more. I would love to talk more about why we all think that is, that we are so far behind in our comprehension of this issue. So
yeah, thank you so much, Molly. I mean, I think it's really important for our audience, here today, to really think about that. Climate change worsens air pollution and it exacerbates those inequities. And really, at the heart of a lot of this, unfortunately, is environmental racism. And that's just it. I think you pointed to something that's incredibly profound here that not a lot of folks get to, very quickly. And so thank you for using that and for being here with us. I think I can speak, in terms of most recently, there was a report that came out, EDF and Green Latinos. So really looking at how Latinos are more likely to live in areas with high exposure to hazardous waste, high concentrations of air pollution. And that's, in contrast to the white population. And so this is something that there needs to be more conversation about, really honing in on why is that, in this particular report, scientists had calculated that Latinos on average breathe in over 60%, 63% of the tiny particulate matter, right? That's little air pollution. And so how does it, nestle into the lungs? And you're talking about going to the nurse's office and seeing all those inhalers. And, I can think to myself as a kid, it was like, well, which color inhaler should I be using? Is it the red one? Is it the gray one? And so this is just it, is right. That shouldn't be our reality. And so thank you for, sharing those insights. I know as we shift this panel along, Tonya is really going to bring us into addressing some really key issues as well among, Black women voters and like telling us a bit more about that power at the polls, because my goodness, Tonya, thank you so much for everything you're doing and everything, that the Black women in this community have done to lead in this particular area.
Yeah, absolutely. Hello, ladies. I'm excited for this time. Betsy, you hit on something that I want to just briefly talk about, how Black women, we went from fighting for the right to vote to influencing this very important 2020 election. Black women have been influencing movements for a while. So this definitely is not a new 2020 thing, you know what I mean? And though Black women are less remembered, despite their activism beginning as early as the late 1800s, and were underrepresented in some of the most famous moments from the history of voting rights in the 1900s, they played an important role in getting two important amendments passed. The 15th, that gave African-American men the right to vote, and then 50 years later, the 19th Amendment, securing those same rights for women. And even then, African-American women did not have the freedom to vote in significant numbers until the passage of the 1965 Voting Rights Act. So, this Black woman influence is 150 years in the making. So for me to vote, I pay homage to our voting rights mothers, who worked quietly behind the scenes in a very loud way. So like Mary Church Terrell, and I'm probably going to forget some people, Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, Sojourner Truth, Ida B. Wells, there's so many. I pay homage to the 24 African-American women who, from Howard University, who marched in 1913 in the Women's Suffrage Parade. It was a precursor and a catalyst to the Black sororities that went viral on social media for the Stroll to the Polls movement here in Atlanta. And that movement was founded by my friend, my sorority sister, who literally had a desire to get Black people to the polls nationwide. And another monumentally, effort that happened here in Georgia is my very own Spelman sister, Stacey Abrams. After losing her gubernatorial election, or her race, I should say, in 2018, instead of her sulking in her loss and, talking about the real allegations of voter suppression, she founded Fair Fight, an organization devoted to registering voters. And as a result of that founding, more than 800,000 new voters were registered in Georgia for the 2020 election. So these efforts were powerful and they worked. According to the Pew Research Center, the number of eligible Black voters was a record 30 million for this presidential election. And 1/3 of those live in the battleground states like Pennsylvania, Georgia, and Michigan. But one of the things, Betsy, I want to talk about, it's incredible for Black women to be recognized as the voice that saved the election. But I want to stress the importance of understanding that Black women are not the savior of the nation. There's still a lot of work to be done, with that involves all nationalities, races, and both genders. With this new administration, taking its helm, and it's got a Black woman in a significant position, it's not just the Black woman's job to bring healing and unification to the nation. When there's so many wounds that still exist, just from 2020 alone. It's not the responsibility of Black women to coddle others while explaining why you're in any type of leadership position. And it is certainly inappropriate to think that it's time to leverage a Black woman's insights about centuries of racial injustice. You mentioned
Just one moment while we bring Tonya back. Right now, you are tuning into Mom's Clean Air Force, EcoMadres, and Corazon Latino's Cafecito. So if you haven't already got yourself a cup of something delicious, please go ahead and grab that now. We're going to keep this conversation going while we wait to get Tonya's connection back. Again, we're talking about mobilizing voters and mobilizing voters of color during one of the most important elections of our lifetime. I know that something Molly had asked me as we were getting ready for this conversation is, what about Michigan, right? A lot of folks are familiar with that woman from Michigan, our governor here. And again, we're looking at tremendous opportunities and potentials for leadership. And I do want to give a nod to one of our program partners, Corazon Latino. Corazon Latino is a national nonprofit that has been working to generate social, environmental, conservation initiatives. So a lot of stewardship, a lot of planting and hugging trees. That's a shout out to Felipe Benitez there. But this election cycle and the C3 work that they have done, they were able to reach over 100,000 voters. And those were voters in Arizona, Florida, Pennsylvania, Ohio, and 30,000 here in Michigan. So when we talk about the power of leveraging our communities and our relationships, I will say, extending a call out to Felipe. And Felipe, like here in my adopted home state, there's a multiracial collaborative in Grand Rapids and Muskegon, area women leaders, climate and racial justice advocates who have a yearning to get involved. We see that there hasn't been enough engagement in our communities. What can we do? Big shout out to I'm Deeply Rooted, Revolutionaries Demanding Justice, Justice for Black Lives, and those who really rolled up their sleeves alongside me, because we knew this election, the stakes had never been higher in and around social injustice. And let's talk about COVID too, really high rates there. And so again, this goes to those power of those relationships, right? Like, as we can't always look to established organizations to reach our communities. That's really where we have to become those agents for change. Welcome back to the conversation. We just
are working and moving in a great way. Technology takes over. In the middle of your conversation.
All good, all good. We took a minute to refresh our souls, get our beverages on hand, walked folks through a little bit of what's going down in Michigan. But if you could, bring us back. I know something we've been talking a lot about has been voter suppression. What is that? Like, what does that mean? And how did that also influence in and around as we're talking about this election and engagement?
I would have to say, I know here in Georgia, when I went to vote, it took me about 4 hours to vote. And then there were some locations, I had a friend who actually waited 11 hours to vote. And, she was like, I'm going to stand in line. I'm not going to move. I have a chair. I have a bag. I have, conversations. I've met friends who are going to hold my place in line if I got to go stretch or, take a restroom break. And, a lot of those long hours of waiting were in the communities where people didn't think that there was going to be a good voter outcome. And it happened. There was still great voter outcome. People waited in line. So, that was, that was some of the stuff that I saw here in Georgia. I have to say that.
That's really good to reflect on, because I think, in the media, we've seen a lot of those images, right, of the lines that wrap around. In one, we do want to say that we have seen more voters in this previous election than ever before. But also, that's really important to talk about, is to think about who are those who have not had the access, or why is there not more universal absentee ballots, as well as other ways to be able to engage in this election. And so I think, that really brings us to the next part of our conversation, which is really thinking a lot about, about how we're moving forward, right? Like, we know that this was a high stakes election, and we know that, this climate crisis is exacerbated right now, and folks are feeling a lot with COVID. And I think, one of the things that we do want to make sure we note is just that this election and the results really need to amplify and, bring that magnifying glass, right, about the efforts of so many individuals and community organizations and folks that found themselves volunteering, becoming parts of efforts to get out the vote, efforts to get folks to the polls, efforts to make sure that voter intimidation was not something that folks were experiencing. And so if you are listening and you had any role in bringing out those voters, please know that we're raising our glasses to you in complete acknowledgement of all the efforts and the mighty good that you've been able to bring. So as we shift forward, I know we've probably got a bit of time here. Would love to hear from you all, just those next steps of what folks should be thinking about as we're thinking about this climate crisis, especially. We also know that there is some Senate runoffs that are coming up in Georgia. What are ways that people can continue to be involved, but also can become those advocates if they're really interested in getting involved, either with EcoMadres or Mom's Clean Air Force or Corazon Latino, or they're just thinking about how can I, as we're on the cusp of this holiday, how can I have those virtual, socially distant conversations with family members about why climate and why now? Why does this matter more than ever? So I'll extend that to the panel and see if any of y'all want to kick us off.
Well, I actually want to make a very quick point about long lines at the polls, because long lines in and of themselves is a form of voter suppression, right? And I think there's a lot. I think there's a lot to be said for the way we make it more difficult than it needs to be. In communities, in cities, switching polling places, not knowing where you're supposed to go, not having information easily accessible in multiple languages. There are just so many things that I think could be done better to support every single community and every single voter who wants to go to the polls. So just wanted to put a really fine point on that, Tonya, because I know we've talked about those long lines in Georgia. There were long lines in Philly for some of the drop-offs, but on election day, so many people had voted early that there were not as many. And I would say just very briefly, in terms of moving forward, I would encourage every single person in this country, if they don't already know, to find out who their state and local legislators are and pick up the phone to their office. It's harder now. Send an email. They all have websites. You can look at them on your smartphone or your computer. Find out who they are and figure out a way to engage them in conversation. It could be as simple as an email saying, I live here, I'm your constituent, and I care about the climate crisis. Can you tell me what you're doing in the city of Philadelphia to work toward a safer future for our kids? What are you doing in my district in Pennsylvania? What is my state senator doing? What is my US senator and my member of Congress doing? But starting at the very bottom, the very local, most close levels of government is the first thing I would say to people. And it took me well into my 30s to understand how important that was, which is shameful. but it's a really powerful thing to know. It's a really powerful thing to do, and it's a really powerful thing to show your children that you're doing.
Yeah, thank you, Molly. And I also want to recognize that for folks that are tuning in, if you're not familiar with the term voter suppression, so what we're talking about here is the ease at which individuals who have the legal right to vote are able to vote. And in many cases, there's a lot of obstruction, there's manipulation that is intended to block individuals, often, individuals of color, from being able to vote. And so that's what we're talking about, is those obstructive mechanisms, whether it's voter ID laws and or, again, like voter purges is perhaps something else that you've heard of. Also, I know that in getting out the vote, especially in places like Florida, felony disenfranchisement has been something also that has been another form of that voter suppression. So we do want to make sure that folks know that that's some of the ways that we're talking about this, as well as gerrymandering. So how are the district lines within your state featured around which populations? So again, often you will start to see that some of those population changes as those lines are drawn are reflective around racial diversity.
I was going to say that, you see so much unification now in Atlanta between Black and Latino groups mobilizing because of this runoff that we have, right? We're mobilizing in the middle of an incredibly challenging political environment, right? So, organizations like Mi Familia Vota, they're on the ground. Partnering with the Latino Community Fund and the Georgia Association, let me get this right, Georgia Association of Latino Elected Officials on voter registration and education. It's actually launching a bilingual field and digital campaign that Cindy and I just learned about that's aimed at 250,000 Latino voters in the state. So they're trying to gain more Latino voters. And so, again, I mentioned with Fair Fight, they're on the ground partnering with the New Georgia Project, so it's just a lot of mobilizing that's going on here in Atlanta. And, frankly, as you pointed out, Betsy, it's also virtual. So even though it's organizing here on the grounds, you can do this from anywhere. And so it's a perfect opportunity for people to get involved and learn a bit more about their voting rights, about how to be more involved. So I'm really proud about that that coming together to do that.
Yeah, I think there's a real beauty and power in solidarity. Most recently here in my adopted state of Michigan, we got together predominantly Black and brown women and held a tree planting. And so that, again, a big thanks to Corazon Latino for sponsoring that for us. But there was something about being able to honor the earth. We had a local Indigenous leader also guide us through a ceremony. And what did that feel like? Just to be able to have those moments of joy, feeling the texture of the earth under our hands, like watching people at that distance, we're all wearing our masks. But seeing also that in some ways, this is like giving life, right? And so that's the resurgence. And I think that also goes back to the power of women and like these deep rooted relationships. Cindy?
Yeah, I just I wanted to touch a little bit on the voter suppression aspect and just reflecting on the experience that I had here in Nevada. I feel that we're very lucky with the current leadership that we have because our first go around having to hold an election during the pandemic was in June when we had our primary. Everyone that was on the voter rolls received a mail-in ballot. But it was the first time that our state was holding an election during a pandemic. And our local electoral, our Clark County registrar had no idea how many people were going to vote in person versus mail-in ballots. So there were just not enough locations during our primary for voting in person or early voting. And there wasn't much information out there either. I mean, I'm involved in all of this and I had to dig in a little bit deeper to find information. And what was found was that the last person that voted during primary voted at 3 o'clock in the morning. And I had been in line since, I don't know, but it was 3 o'clock in the morning. And there's a lot of our partners, like Tonya, you mentioned, Mi Familia Vota, they're here on the ground too. They do a lot of great work. Another one of our partners, Make the Road Nevada, and just other organizations got involved with our elected officials and said, hey, this is unacceptable. You cannot have people waiting online until 3 o'clock in the morning to cast a vote, especially when there's a pandemic. Luckily, we had a special session that was called by the governor to address our budget issues. And one of the things that they did address, our leadership in the legislature, they introduced Assembly Bill 4, which made it easier for people to vote. It opened it up for same-day voter registration, and it gave more guidance as far as what needed to be done. And because our leadership, they learned from the lessons that would happen during the primary, they opened up more polling locations, both during early voting and election day. And then they also had separate ballot drop-off sites, so you didn't have to go where other people were voting and could just drop it off. And our county registrar, if, for example, I decided to vote where down the street because I just went to the website and it gave me the waiting times. So luckily where I live, like there was never a wait. So I was able to go and I was home within like 15 minutes or even less. But for folks that maybe their voting site had an hour or 2 hour wait, they could look on the website and say, hey, you know what? The location right down the street from my house has a 2 hour wait. I'm just going to drive 10 minutes or 15 minutes and not wait in line. And so I found it amazing that our leaders were able to learn from that experience in June and turn it around, because they did listen to the organizations on the ground doing the work. So we did still have long lines during early voting, especially the first day and the last day, but on election day, it just ran smoothly. But there's just so many things going on the ground, and I can go on and on.
Yeah, I think as we start to think about all those things that are going on the ground, I mean, it's the reminder that this is a very intersectional movement, and it's led by a lot of folks from all walks of life. For those that are tuning in, please do go ahead and extend any questions you have in the chat box. Molly's watching that for us so that we can make sure that we integrate those into our conversation today. Again, I think, a large part about, what was so motivating in this election is because so many of us, were really trying to think about, our families, our extended families. We've had this pandemic, on our minds, also thinking about the burden that so many others are carrying. And so, would love to hear if any of you all, as Cindy noted, she was able to share that deep reflection. What are some things you've been hearing from others? Obviously Moms and EcoMadres is really on the ground working with a lot of networks. And so just curiosities around either why folks were voting, or what are you hearing also about how they're looking forward? Because we know this wasn't only about 2020. There are, primary elections, presidential elections to come. And so, what's the feeling?
I think I actually, and being in, Tonya and I have talked about her being in Georgia and Atlanta, and me being in Philly, and feeling all of the power and the anxiety. Like, I don't want us to have to worry that it's going to be us, yes or no, And also a lot of the, I think a lot of the people that I've talked to, and again, it's hard, it's hard to really see my friends in my community here in Philly, especially as COVID cases start to spike significantly here again. But honestly, I think that it's not. People have said to me, there's been so much fear about keeping your family safe, and what's the plan, and how are we going to do this, and when are my kids going to go back to school? And so I think in a lot of respects, people I have been talking to started to realize that voting is like, I can do this thing, it's like the one thing I can do. I don't know how I'm going to do it, but I don't know if I'm going to mail it in, or I'm going to go to a Dropbox, or I got to make a plan. And just the real like intensity around this something that I can control. And I have not heard that kind of intensity about feeling that your vote was so important that I heard this year. And I think, unfortunately, it was because we all feel very out of control. And, in my life, it's like, well, I can make, all the plans, and I can control this, and I can control that, and I can make sure my kids get to school, and I can control anything about this. There's nothing. And so voting became this, like, this is a thing I can do. And no matter how you're voting, who you're voting for, it is a thing I can do. And what I would love to see is voting the next time there's a local election, doing your research on whatever the ballot questions are, and figuring out how you're answering those, and who is your city council. I mean, there are just so many things that I want to be able to keep up this momentum and this intensity around how important, my vote is my voice, count every vote, all of the things that we've been saying, and all of the ways in which we've seen in an unprecedented way, people's votes trying to be, people trying to discount, discredit, toss out legitimate votes, and muting the voices of Americans. And so I think that makes us even more sort of ferocious, about how our vote counts. And maybe coming out of this in future elections, we'll see higher voter turnout that's more sustained. That's all I want. I want people to understand it's not just every 4 years.
Yeah. One of the things that I was going to mention before technology tried to take over, from conversations that I've had in the community, with individuals who are in those low income minority communities, they're concerned about, these high dense sacrificial zone areas that they live in, those areas that are, primarily within a mile of those oil and gas operations, where there is a significant exposure to air pollution. And that same survey that Molly mentioned, it found that Black adults, 60%, are nearly twice as likely as white adults to say that they are concerned about air pollution in their local community. And also Black adults are also significantly more likely than white adults to say that they're concerned about water pollution. What's going on in Michigan, and climate change. And so, talking to mothers in the community, these have been concerns for Black mothers for a long time. They understand that 1 in 9 African-American children are affected by asthma. Black children are over, 3 times more likely to be admitted to the hospital for asthma. Molly talked about asthma. Over 1 million African-Americans live, as I said, within that 1 mile of those operations, and the schools that are serving Black children are located closer to those heavily trafficked roads. So when Molly talked about, my vote is my voice, a lot of those same mothers feel like this particular administration, when they started talking about climate, when they started talking about environmental justice, and they made that a priority, Black women, mothers in particular, they finally felt that they were being heard, like at least one little area of life, they're being heard. And so they're like, I'm going to vote, I'm going to mobilize behind this, because we have got to make some of those policy changes that are affecting our children. And so that's a lot of what I've been hearing, even before election and then now, like, oh, yes, we are finally being heard. So.
That is there's something about that connection, and something about knowing, right, that your voice is not just in an echo chamber, but it's resonating. I mean, I can say, much like what Molly reflected on, as a mom, hustling to get out the vote, this election mattered so much, because I have a 5-year-old who could tell me, Mom, make sure you're voting about this, and make sure you're taking care of our planet, and there's something about that, right? Like that's how we get that next generation of youth so inspired. And we did. I want to make sure that we take some time to acknowledge the youth vote, because youth really showed up in this election. Also, I know we have represented what is going on in Georgia, Nevada, Pennsylvania, and also Michigan, but let's give a huge shout out in Arizona. In Arizona, we have really seen Indigenous communities leading that fight, being able to get, interwoven within their own communities and bringing that forward. So not only, a huge shout out to the Indigenous community there, but also to those community networks, because folks have shown, in the face of great adversity, that they are still feet on the street. They're doing the mobile campaigns. They're doing a lot of the phone banking. And I think this is just it, right? It's like we saw in the weeks following the election, there was a lot of credit taken and a lot of folks patting themselves on the back. And, it was so beautiful, though, that when you could see the natural, the more organic generation of like, thank you, Black women, thank you, Indigenous women, thank you, women of color, and, thank you, youth vote. And so for the folks that are tuning in at home, we really want to make sure that we're thinking about that, and so as you're giving thanks, if that is something that you do within your home, we know the historical significance of Thanksgiving and how complicated that is, as well as we're thinking about racism and we're thinking about colonization. But if we go back to the seeds of gratitude, who are those people that you would like to say thank you to and for? And I think that's something, that I think we want to do more of, right? It's so often it's spoken as soft skills, right? So if we start talking about love and the interconnectedness, it's a soft skill, and it's not. It's actually a very hard skill to put into action. I call this my heart work, right? Like it's the way that we connect. And so just want to make sure that we're keeping that in mind. And so, folks at home, if you have questions for any of our extraordinary panelists, please go ahead, drop those in the chat box. I'm going to go ahead and open this to the floor and just see if there's something that we haven't quite covered that folks are yearning to share.
Well, I actually had a thought and a memory of my 11-year-old, my 6th grade daughter, who is probably the most aware of so many issues. And she, she's working on social justice projects in her remote learning class, and she's constantly, I hear her up in her room having these intense conversations with her classmates. And she said to me, when I was getting ready, when we walked over to the drop box, me and both my daughters and myself. And she said to me, she was like, Mom, most of my friends, their parents can't vote. So we have to vote for them. And it's just like so powerful, right? And I thought of it earlier when Cindy said that about, voting for her family members who couldn't vote. And it also made me realize that Black women and Latinas and Indigenous women that we're recognizing now, y'all have always been here, and I said that before. I find I have so much gratitude and I have so much love, but this isn't a fight. The climate fight, the air pollution fight, all of the social justice fight. You've been in it and in the trenches in it, and the white community needs to understand that this is you didn't just now show up, right? And I just want to recognize that and thank you guys for that, because I know you've been here all along, and people like me have not had to be invisible, and so I really feel, when my daughter said that you have to vote for my friend's parents, it was super powerful, and it made me also recognize that representation is important. Representation at every level of government is important. Representation of women of all types is important. And we have to find a way to make sure everyone's voices are heard. So.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think when we've spoken about power and privilege, I will say, Molly, I deeply appreciate how you show up, right? How you show up for others, and also how you elevate others, and how you use the power and privilege that you have. And And I love hearing about that, right? You have like this really inspired kiddo in the house that's like, we need to do for others, because that's a lot of how this work starts, and the momentum starts, and the movement continues to grow. I recognize we've got just under 10 minutes with folks today. So really want to make sure that, as we're leaving those seeds, what are those calls to action? What are the things that folks should do? How can they get involved? And also, if folks want to get in touch with y'all, how can that happen?
Well, I wanted to throw out there's a lot going on in Nevada on the climate change front. Last year, the governor signed an executive order saying that we will be carbon neutral by 2050, and that the state would create a climate initiative to really hear from Nevadans as far as like what they would like to see or what they're experiencing when it has to do with climate change. The governor's office created the Nevada Climate Initiative, and they had the listening sessions. They had 8 different ones around air quality, transportation, green jobs, environmental justice. Those were some that we were able to participate in. However, Moms Clean Air Force and EcoMadres were part of the coalition here, Nevada Environmental Justice Coalition, with 10 other organizations. And we noticed that the outreach they were doing was just in English and not multilingual. So they were already leaving a huge chunk of the population out from the process. And we wrote a letter to the governor's office and expressed that they needed to have a listening session in other languages. We asked for Spanish and Tagalog, but we were able to get one in Spanish. Same thing happened with Clark County, where Las Vegas is. They're currently going through their Transform Clark County master plan, trying to figure out what Las Vegas will look like in the next 50 years. Again, the website just in English, survey just in English. Our coalition showed up in full force, and now anything that they're doing is also in Spanish. And we're working with them to make sure that they're accommodating multilingual speakers that want to show up and speak and give opinions of what Las Vegas will look like 50 years from now, or even 5 years from now. So we talk about showing up to vote and registering, but there's so many things that you can do at your local level. I talk about the things that are going on here in Nevada. So I'm working with our members and other organizations and making sure that our voices are heard. And it just shows that when you show up in full force and you have the backing of other organizations, things happen. They started listening to us, and now the county is going, they started their climate action plan, and immediately, without us even sending a letter, now they have a survey in Spanish, English, and Tagalog. So it just shows that they do listen. And I know that not everyone has access to Zoom or internet, or they're able to just drop what they're doing and make a phone call. But these are issues that do matter and are important. And maybe, if you're not able to call, at least send an email or contact them on Facebook. A lot of the local electeds are very active on social media, and they do look at what you're writing to them. They may not acknowledge it, but they are. So those are just other ways that you can get involved. It's not just the ballot box, it's so many other ways. And if you're interested in joining us, EcoMadres and Moms Clean Air Force, we're always looking for more volunteers and to add more to our moms and our EcoMadres.
Yes, and you can join on momscleanairforce.org, and you can join our email list and keep up to date on all of our issues that are impact a national audience. And we also work across the country in different states on state level issues. I will just very quickly, in Pennsylvania, we have been working for years to advocate for stronger rules from oil and gas pollution. Pennsylvania, just behind Texas, is the second largest natural gas producing state in the country. And with that comes an outsized pollution problem. We're getting there. It hasn't been easy, but we've been working on it for years, and we're coming to the home stretch for better methane rules. And we're also working to we're part of a coalition working to advocate for Pennsylvania to join the regional greenhouse, to link to the regional greenhouse gas initiative that we call RGGI, in order to cut carbon pollution. And those are just two tiny little steps. That's barely at the tip of the iceberg of what we have to do. You know, there's no magic bullet. It's all things in all ways. But we're working, that's what we're doing in Pennsylvania. And if you join Moms and you live in Pennsylvania, you'll get information about those things as well. And I'll let Tonya take it away.
Yeah, one of the things that I wanted to talk about is our Community RX program. It is a program where we advocate on behalf of the African American community. And it's just been really interesting navigating our way into our communities. And it's so funny, you know, I had conversations this week with some faith-based, hopefully new partners. They're like, how do we even start the conversation? You know, we don't know where to start, you know. And so I just wanted to put it out there. We actually have a 5-week Bible study curriculum via Community RX, where it literally talks about how you are empowered to care for the earth. And so in caring for the earth, that means getting involved in these climate conversations and getting involved on the grounds. And so I just wanted to give a shout out to our Community RX program and ways that you can get involved. Come to our Moms Clean Air Force website, find me, email me, call me, whatever. Come and join us. We got a lot of work to do.
I love that. Thank you for all the wealth of knowledge and information you all have shared with our audience. A couple of things I want to make sure we make note of is that today is Transgender Day of Remembrance. So we want to make sure that, you know, we're keeping that in mind and in heart for that particular community. We're also thinking about the Arctic Refuge defense. So we know that the Arctic Refuge is currently under attack. Again, that's threatening Indigenous peoples, wildlife, and really a place that has been relatively untouched since time immemorial. Also want to note that one of our hosts and sponsors here, Corazon Latino, is doing some incredible work in Guatemala. So they're working directly with Consulado General de Guatemala in Los Angeles because of the tropical depression. So if you're looking for other ways to get involved, please do stay in touch with these great folks at Moms Clean Air Force, EcoMadres, and Corazon Latino. We are so thankful again for your time today. And again, you know, use your agency, use your power, and do what you can to make the difference either within your own household, hyper locally, or at the global level if you can. Thank you so much for joining us today. We're going to go ahead and sign off, and we look forward to having another cup of cafecito with you soon.